Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we are back in War Thunder looking at a new vehicle. This is the P40 Leoncello, and it is a rank 2 battle rating 3.3 Italian tank. And as you can see, there isn't any tech tree for the Italian tanks, but it is the first technical Italian we have in the game. And then we have the M26, which is a copy of the American one, so I don't think I will do a video on it. So the P40 Leoncello you're able to get in a bundle, and I will put a link in the description if you would like to take it. But overall, this is going to be a general review of it. Obviously, when other vehicles are released, it will be slightly different. The main difference is, right now, if you spawn this in tank battles, you do actually get 3 respawns of it instead of 1. But when the Italian tech tree is released, you will only get 1. Let's have a look at the armor profile of this machine. On the front, you're looking at about 50mm, sloped at 45 degrees, giving you an effective thickness of about 65mm, nothing crazy. There's a nice hutch on the front, which is in front of the driver, so that has about effective of 100mm. And then at the bottom, we have 45 and 50 for the lower glacis and the mid-hull. Once again, on average, around 65-70mm. The turret itself is 50 once again, with a 48mm gun shield, and also another 48 behind it, I'm guessing, looking at the model here, as you can see. And then you have the flat part, which is, once again, 50mm. On the sides, we're looking at 45 and 45, and then on the back of it, 40, 40, and then 15 for the engine deck, 20 for the top of the turret. Looking on the X-ray view, we have a crew of 4, a machine gunner, driver, gunner, and of course commander, who is also the loader at the same time. So if you lose one of these guys, then your loading is going to be decreased heavily. The ammunition is mainly stored on the right-hand side of the vehicle, looking forward. Some is in the side, so you may want to adjust your ammunition to make sure that those side stuff isn't there, so you don't get popped. It has a fuel tank and a massive engine in the back, which has 330 horsepower. Its main armament is a 75mm Ansaldo 75L34 gun, and it does have 63 rounds of ammunition. You do have a coaxial 8mm Breda, and of course an 8mm Breda on the top as well. So 2 machine guns and the main gun itself, obviously the vertical aiming drive, and some optics around the place as well. As you may be able to tell by the model, a lot of it is riveted, which is always fun. Go and ask the British. But if we look at the modifications, you will find that this actually has a smoke grenade. And the smoke grenade is kind of interesting. It actually drops from the back. You can actually see them here on the model. And it just drops behind you. You can retreat into it. If you're going forward, it's not going to be too useful for you. But it's still nice to see them. I don't think they're in the X-ray view. No, they're not. Maybe in a future update. Being a premium bundle vehicle, you get it all modified straight away, so you don't have to worry about researching anything. Being a medium tank, even though it was kind of technically labeled as a heavy tank in real life, it does get access to artillery. It also, as I said, has the smoke grenades, but the main thing that is interesting on it is the fact that it has a very odd gun. So if you look at the 75 APC-BC shell, the armor-piercing ballistic cap shell, it has 624 meters per second muzzle velocity, which isn't very good, projectile mass of 6.2 kilos, but it does have an explosive mass of 270 grams. On the heat shell, you are looking at 513 grams of explosive mass at 552 meters per second. Penetration of 100, this has 75, so you're probably going to be using this more. So being a lower velocity, obviously it's not, you're going to have to get used to aiming it, even at 3.3. So let's compare the explosive mass to this to a Tiger 2H, because I think that's quite good, the 88. So 270 and 513. So let's go over to the Tiger 2H. If I actually have it, there it is. And if we open up the modifications, sorry about this, I am uploading at the same time, so the server's getting a bit rowdy. This has an explosive mass of 64 grams. And imagine how much damage the Tiger II-H main round does. Let's actually also compare it to something which is a little bit closer. The Panzer IV F2, which has the 75mm at 3.3, so same BR. If you look at this, 17 grams. The heat shell, 513. So that's, you know, at least closer than that of the AP round. So this has a ridiculous... this has a ridiculous main armament on it if you are able to penetrate. 270 and 513. Absolutely crazy. This is very similar to the heat shell you'll find on the Panzer IV F2, but if you're able to get this to pen, oh my god, it's going to do so much damage compared to other 75s in the game. If you want to have a look at the winter camouflage, which is available for 200 golden eagles, this is what it looks like, very standard. And unfortunately, you can't... Oh no, sorry, you can unlock it, 150 players defeated, so that's about 75 with the ×2 in RB and SB if you play that. And it does look kind of nice when you look at it. Nope, let's just go back to standard. Decorators, I do have some of the bushes, so I do want to show where you can actually put the bushes on this machine. So you can put it here if you want. Whoop. You can also put it in this position, which is probably the one the majority of people are going to use. And then you can also put it, not really on the turrets, but you can put it on the side. So if you have two large bushes, you can cover the machine overall. So yeah, coverage on bush is pretty good for the Leoncello. It has a very interesting gun on it. Not a lot of armor, but vertical guidance of a -10 gun depression will always help you out with that. It's definitely an interesting machine. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into the history of this machine, and then we're going to have a look at some gameplay. The history of the Caro Armato P2640 is a very interesting one, mainly because it's another one of these vehicles which was actually never used by the Italians. It was used by the Germans because from 1943 to 45, that's when the Germans basically occupied Italy because of the Italian armistice. Now, if you want to know more about that, I would definitely say go and research it. I'm not really going to talk about it here, but that's just generally why this thing never actually really saw combat for Italy, but for the Germans in Italy. If you want to understand the name, the P actually stands for pesante, which means heavy in Italian. It has a weight of 26 tons, and the year of adoption, or the year when it was actually asked for, was 1940. So that's where you get the P2640 from. Now, the reason why it's classed as a heavy tank by the Italians, but a medium tank by everybody else, is because the Italians decided to name their variants of tanks after their role on the battlefield. So their idea for the P2640 is you would have 1 battalion of them and also 3 battalions of medium tanks. So it would be there to support the 3 companies of medium tanks, and the heavy tanks will be able to take the brunt. So it's not really based on the weight of the machine, but it is based on what role they wanted it to play in the battlefield. When they started developing the P2640, they basically were under specifications from the Italian military branch of the government, where they wanted a machine which was heavier than its predecessors, at least 20 tons, was armed with some kind of 75mm, and would perform the acts of a heavy tank, in their opinion. Their tactics that they thought it would be. So they started off with a 20-ton vehicle, which armed with a 47mm and 3 machine guns and also a crew of 5. So maybe we actually get that in game. That would be kind of interesting. But back to the P26. From that, the fact is the Italians ran into a bunch of T-34s. Not actually on the battlefield. The Germans captured a bunch of Russian T-34s, and they sent them to Italy. Italy had a look at them and realized that this machine that they'd created with the 47mm, and that was 20 tons, and had very, very unangled armor, let's just say that, was not going to cut it against these monsters that they saw before them. So they decided to completely redesign. They put in slopes on the front and the sides. They upgraded the armor from 30 on the sides to 40, and 40 on the front to 50, and they made it sloped. They also put in a bigger gun, so that's where the 75mm comes from. And also there was a bit of a disagreement. The Stato Maggiore, which is the Italian military staff, they actually wanted a diesel power plant to be able to drive this thing. But the builders wanted a petrol engine. And this was basically because a lot of the petrol engines may be able to be modified from Italian aircraft to be put in these machines. So what they ended up doing is they created a prototype in 1941 which had a 420 horsepower petrol engine in it, and they decided to go ahead, but changing the engine. They actually adopted a 300 and around about 350 horsepower engine, or 330 I should say, 243 kilowatt engine, which was the V12 SPA 342 diesel 24 litre. And this was kind of the downfall of the tank. Not because it actually used them in battle, which it did, and it seemed to perform okay for in 1943 to 45. The major issue was supply, and this is something you will see with a lot of Italian vehicles. You will see that the supply of engines or just key parts is just non-existent. So the SPA engine was just not delivered on time, meaning that the majority of P40s which were actually produced were not equipped with engines. This meant that the Germans had to use them as stationary gun points in defensive areas to try and hoard off the invading Allied forces. And sometimes it worked, it worked okay, but because a lot of them couldn't move, they were only good in defensive postures. But when they actually had engines, they were seen as not too bad. They were still seem worse than at the time the Panther, because you've got to remember, by 1943, the Tigers and the Panthers were around. Comparing the P40, the P2640 to these machines is kind of ridiculous. And we may actually see a premium vehicle for the Germans, which is the Carro Armato. And it had a German designation of the Panzerkampfwagen P40-737i. So maybe we see that, maybe with the upgraded engine if they feel like it. Now, the armor was seen sufficient against the British 2-pounder, so the 40mm that you will find on vehicles such as the Matilda in-game, but it was not good enough against subsequent anti-tank weapons such as the 57mm, the 6-pounder, and the 17-pounder, the 76mm. So it was okay against small emplacements, but it was generally terrible against larger ones. At the same time, generally by the time of 1943, most nations, apart from Italy and Britain, had gone past riveted designs, because riveted armor was very vulnerable to breaking apart at the joints of the rivet, which meant that you could create a plate which was as thick as you wanted, but if a rivet was hit, then generally the plate would become useless. So most people went onto welding designs instead of it. So even though the P40 had okay frontal armor, it did have these issues, and I wonder if they're going to be represented in-game. Another issue that was seen by it, that it didn't have any modern suspension, and it also didn't have a cupola for the commander, which at the time was pretty standard if you look at the German vehicles and if you look at the American ones as well. Also, it had a 4-man crew. Now, a 5-man crew seemed to be the standard by 1943 or even 1942 or 41. this meant that the commander was not overbeared with what he had to do. In the P40, he was overbeared. The lucky thing was there was a machine gunner in the bottom of the hull which could actually take care of the radio, so at least that was out of his hands. But what he had to do was spot targets. He had to either shoot or reload the gun depending on what he wanted to do, and he had to be able to turn the turret as well. So he had all of these things going on while also commanding the tank, which is definitely seen as something you shouldn't do with these vehicles. You should try and stick to just one role, which is why we saw the adoption of a 5-man crew. Now, what is interesting is there were some variants which were spawned off the P40 design, because generally in 1943 the German Panther came along and they decided that the P40 had to be upgraded. So they made the P43. It had a weight of around 30 tons, armor plates around 50 to 80 millimeters, and it had a main armament of either 75-34 or a 105-23. Now, in September 1943, they developed the new design, which was seen as good as the Panther, which I'm not sure about, but, you know, they say it, and the result was the P43 bis. Now, the difference between this is that it had a 450 horsepower engine, so it was majorly upgraded in that department, and also it had a 90mm on it, a 90-42 gun. And at the same time, the only issue with it was that it never passed wooden mock-up stage, so if we do see it in game, it's going to have to be a wooden mock-up, which is very, very sad. At the same time, they made a ridiculous, powerful gun on it, a self-propelled gun. The Semaventi 14940 was a gun which they decided they needed some kind of artillery piece which was able to easily be set up, be able to have a decent role on moving around the battlefield. So with the 149mm artillery piece, they basically just plonked it on the hull of a P40 and said, "Bob's your uncle." And the main reason they did this is because it would be ready to fire once it gets into position in around 3 minutes, whereas a standard towed artillery that they were using, it would take about 17 minutes to set up. Now, there was a prototype in 1942 of the Semavente 14940, which was started in 1942, tested in 1943, but the Italian army wasn't really impressed either, which is kind of sad, to be honest. And the Germans, after the armistice in 1943 by the Italians, they weren't impressed either. I mean, they had the 88s, they didn't really need anything else. And on top of all of the issues that the P40 had when it came to its engine, just to hammer home another issue they had, in September 1942, the SPA factory in Turin, which was actually making the engines, was also bombed. So, oh my god. You've just got to kind of feel sorry for this machine, because it had a decent amount going for it in 1940, but by the time it was made in 1943, it was obsolete, and by the time it even got its engines, it was even worse. You've got to remember, this thing would be comparable in timeline to Panthers and Tigers, and you're running around in this 26-ton mini tank. It's just ridiculous. But overall, that's the history of it, so let's get into some gameplay. So with the Leoncello being at a BR of 3.3, this basically means you are going to face KV-1s, early Shermans, and T-34s. All of the matches that I've played, I've been matched up with either Germans or Russians or both, against either Americans or against other Russians. So it seems like it is safe to say your main targets are going to be those three vehicles that I talked about. Now, when the vehicle was first looked at on the dev server, a lot of people talked about the explosive mass of both shells. And explosive mass is useful and very good, but the main issue you're going to have with stuff like that is whether you penetrate or not, and also what type of round it is. So the heat shell in the P40 is incredibly good at penetrating. 100mm will go through the front of a KV turret, But as we know, heat shells in the game act very strangely compared to AP shells, and therefore you can only knock out maybe one component before it gets eaten by the tank itself. This means using the heat shell on the Leoncello, what will happen is you will pen the side of a tank and only hit something like a fuel tank, or only taking out a gunner and a turret ring, not doing the massive explosive damage you would be looking for. So in a lot of times, I think the way to go is to start off with the APC-BC round, and then if you come up against targets with a bit more armor, such as the KV-1s, use the heat rounds to finish them off. The reload rate of around about 8 seconds is pretty long in this machine, but you've got to remember I'm on pretty much stock cruise right now. I'm pretty sure 6.5 seconds will be attainable, and getting down to that in a machine like this is going to be very useful. The gun depression of 10 degrees also helps out, and it seems like we're in a position right now where not a lot of people are facing these machines. So what actually happens is they shoot pretty much the wrong places. This is why doing a armor discussion doesn't really work at this moment in time. If you want to shoot it, and you have more than 65mm of penetration, you shoot anywhere on the front of it as long as you don't hit the gun mantlet and you don't hit that box which is above the driver. I've seen a lot of people try and shoot that box, and I can kind of understand why, just because it seems like a weak spot, but just understand it is not. Your best bet is just to go for the part right next to it and you'll knock out the turret. Whenever I've died in this machine, it has been to one-shots. A lot of the time, people will take out the transmission of your machine shooting the low glacis, and because it's quite large, it will actually eat it, so, you know, that's kind of nice. But generally, if somebody penetrates you in the turret, you're pretty much going down. Especially against stuff like the 76mm present on the KV-1s and the T-34s. Another thing to talk about is the smoke grenade. I think the smoke grenade might be one of the useless in-game. The reason for this is it drops directly behind you, and let's say you're repairing, it doesn't cover you. So literally you are hindering yourself because you won't be able to see behind you. And maybe if there's enemies behind you, okay, they can't see you. But that's really about it. When it comes to reversing, you've pretty much got a slightly better variant of British reverse. What I mean by this is you pretty much have no reverse gear. You're looking at around 4 kilometers backwards, which is not good at all. Kilometers per hour, of course. Something that is nice though, and not expected, was on flat ground, even on rough terrain, this machine can go 25 to 30 kilometers an hour, which is very, very similar to other machines you will see at this BR, and quite refreshing after reading about the engine troubles that it had in real life. When the engine troubles do come in though, is the fact that climbing hills is definitely an issue that this machine has, and hopefully with time, and when the American tech tree actually comes out, maybe we get a few more flatter maps to help it out a little bit, because playing on stuff like Frozen Pass, Sinai, or I believe it's Sinai, basically that desert map, it might be Saipan, and then stuff like Kuban and Karelia, it just, you know, it really struggles in getting up those hills. So flat ground, it's good. Another issue is with its gun stabilization. So it's great that it can go 25 to 30 kilometers an hour, but its gun bounces all over the place, and this is actually historically accurate. The P40 was actually using some very old suspension by the time it was released in 1943, and that meant that it was quite a bumpy ride for the people inside. And this is represented in the game with the gun just bouncing all over the place. There are a few machines that you can actually get away with using like shoot on the move. A Sherman is an example of this. But in this machine, definitely not. It definitely has issues with that stuff. I seem to also get targeted a lot in this match by bombers. No idea why, but that's what happens. As I said before in the intro, the fact that you can get 3 spawns in this machine because the Italian tech tree hasn't been allowed yet is very nice to use, and even though it is a premium and a bundle machine, you can't research anything. So if you're looking for a machine to research stuff, well, obviously picking up now is not a great idea, but if you want the first Italian tank which is in game, this is definitely quite a nice little pickup. It works well with the Panzer IV F2s, the Panzer IV F2s with their long-barreled 75. I would pretty much say this takes the place of the Panzer IIIs on the German team, and have much more of that brawling idea. It has a slightly better gun, with a slightly slower reload, but it can push up and be a little bit aggressive, especially when people don't know when to shoot you. Because a lot of the armor is angled at a 45 degrees or slightly worse, then what you can do is you can actually angle it effectively as you are pushing forward, which is really, really nice. The commander has a nice binocular view on top of his machine, and even though he doesn't have a cupola, which is nice, the driver's port is okay as well. It's not in the best position, but it is how it is. But your main competition in this machine is going up against KV-1s and T-34s. T-34s, I would say, have the advantage because of their speed and also their gun. The KVs, I've seen some KVs do well against me, I've seen others struggle. I think it's much more down to if you're able to penetrate the turret with the heat shell. Now, even though the muzzle velocity is kind of low on these rounds, which is completely different to the Panzer IV F2 and other machines you might be used to, I haven't had any issues with hitting stuff, and I think that's basically down to the aimer and the fact of how these rounds fly through the air. They fly very true. There doesn't seem to be a lot of inaccuracy with this gun, which is very nice. And that's always something to look forward to on any machine, to be honest. So overall, I've enjoyed this tank so far. I think it definitely struggles against the best tanks at its tier, but then again, what doesn't? But it is a great complement to the Axis teams that it runs with. If this actually faced the machines it did in real life, yeah, it would definitely struggle. But the fact is, this is War Thunder, and at 3.3, it's facing machines it probably would have never faced. The heat shell is fun, but just understand it isn't a one-shot kill like an APC-BC round. It will only take out a few components, and that's about it. The AP round, if you can get it to pen, it's gonna blast everybody out of the air. It's got a decent amount of speed, and also its traverse. Its traverse is very good. Not its turret traverse, but its general turning with the tracks. It works extremely well. I've enjoyed it so far. I'm really looking forward to the Italian tree to see the other variants of this machine in that Italian tree so I can grind them out. And well, we'll have to see how it does in the future when those machines are released. You can also run it with the P108 and the C205, which are two wonderful machines. The P108 is good either in the attacking role or in the 7,500 kilo role, which is also great. And then you have a very competent fighter in the C205. So all around, you can make a lovely lineup with this thing right now. All you need is an AA and maybe a heavy tank, which we will hopefully see in the future. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.